Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and it's time for another books episode. This is the best books of 2023, Part 1. If you're not familiar with these books episodes, we do this twice a year, once at the middle of the year and once at the end of the year, to discuss all the books that I read during the year, to review them, discuss them. Are they good or not? Should you read them? Who might be interested in them? I like these. It's great to kind of do a review of all of the big ideas that I've been thinking about during the course of a year. And I read enough that it has to kind of be split into two. Otherwise, the episode would simply be far too long. And so we normally have a lot of fun with these. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, we appreciate your support. Throw us a like, throw us a recommendation on social media. If you really enjoy the podcast and want to support us financially, you can do so on patreon.com/neoliberalpodcast, or you can become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org. Supporters and members get access to our bonus episodes, our Slack, and a bunch of other cool perks. So join today. With that said, let's jump right into the episode. So the first books that I normally talk about in these episodes are the books that I did not really enjoy. The books that I ultimately would not recommend that you read. Usually there's only a couple of them, and in this episode, that's the case as well. There are two books that unfortunately I just did not enjoy very much, and I did not get a lot out of, and I did not think that I would recommend to anyone else. Let's cover those two first. The first one is called Everything I Need, I Get From You. The subtitle is How Fangirls Created the Internet as We Know It. It's by Caitlin Tiffany. I was very excited to read about this, especially with the subtitle about the internet, because I am super, super interested in how the internet developed and how we use social spaces on the internet. If you don't know, I'm writing a new blog. It's called Infinite Scroll, and you should definitely go sub to it. It's amazing, trust me. But Infinite Scroll is about this topic of like, how do we behave online? How do we behave in these weird social spaces on social media sites? What's the structure of those sites? How do they influence us? I think all of that deserves way more analysis than it gets in kind of a serious manner. And so the idea that one particular subculture of people has heavily influenced the development of social media or the development of the internet itself, that's a fascinating topic for me. I would love to learn more about that. Unfortunately, the book does a little bit of a bait and switch and does not actually spend that much time on that topic, despite kind of selling itself that way. To be fair, the book does spend a little bit of time on that topic. There's, 10 or 11 chapters, and one chapter basically is about that. Maybe half of that chapter or 2/3 of a chapter are about that topic. How does this one subculture, fangirls, interact with that kind of idea of how the internet has developed? How were they influential? But what the book really is about, for almost all of it, is an exploration of the author's personal fandom with One Direction. This is theoretically a book about fandom and fangirling in general, but really it is a book about the specific fandom for One Direction. This is a boy band. I believe they call themselves Directioners. The fans do. Almost the entire book is about the Directioners and the One Direction fandom, and it gets into crazy amounts of dense, just historical recapping of all of the drama that has happened in the One Direction fandom, which the author is apparently a significant part of. The author has been a part of the One Direction fandom for like decades. To give just kind of one example about how I kind of felt misled, as I said, there's about half a chapter or maybe 2/3 of a chapter on the idea that I was interested in. How did fangirl culture contribute to the development of the internet and social media? there are probably like 5 chapters that at least partially cover the idea of Larry Styleson, which is a conspiracy theory that 2 of the members of the band are in a secret relationship. Larry Styleson is just a combination of the names of 2 of the members, Harry Styles, Louis Tomlinson. There's no evidence for this whatsoever, but Larry Styleson is basically a fan fiction bordering on conspiracy theory that they are in a secret relationship. Some of them believe it's just a fun fan fiction thing. For some of them, they just like to imagine it because, I don't know, they get off on it, I guess. Some of them actually think this is real. Some of them believe that these 2 members of the band are in a secret, forbidden romance that they will not let the public see. It is a wild conspiracy theory, and the book spends like 100 pages on it. It's unbelievable. I know more about the Larry Styleson conspiracy theory and the subcultures and warring factions within that conspiracy theory than any human should ever know. There easily 10 times as much effort went into the Larry Styleson writing as went into talking about how fangirls influence the internet. And so ultimately, I can't recommend the book. It's an interesting premise, and I was hooked by the idea, but the book is kind of sold in a different way from what it actually is. I'm still interested in the idea overall, and I'm actually going to be reading a book in the next couple weeks that is a second attempt at this called Fangirls, Scenes from Modern Music Culture, to try to understand this more. But ultimately, Everything I Need I Get From You by Caitlin Tiffany, something I can't personally recommend. Too much of a personal documentation of the author's obsession and not enough actual attempt to understand the phenomenon. The second book that I can't recommend is a little bit painful to admit, but it's Power and Progress by Simon Johnson and Darren Acemoglu. Now, this is a little bit painful because I have really enjoyed Acemoglu's previous work. I really, really think that Why Nations Fail is an incredible book and a very influential book for me. I thought The Narrow Corridor, which is his follow-up to Why Nations Fail with James Robinson, that's also a very sound theoretical book. I think these are books that made important contributions to how I think and how other people should be thinking. And so I'm a fan of Acemoglu's work. That's why it was pretty disappointing to read Power and Progress and just to think that ultimately it's not a well-argued book. It's just not. The book is about the development of technology and the progress of technological development and how that intersects with changes in society. Does technological development actually help everyone? Their answer is no, not automatically. You know, it doesn't help everyone if you have the wrong political system and all the wealth accumulates to the very top, for instance. And that's a fine idea for a book, but in the end, like, this is something I say sometimes about books that I don't really enjoy. A book can be either good or bad, and a book can be either original or unoriginal. Ultimately, what's good in this book is not original. These are ideas that many people have said before. And what's original in this book and new is not good. The stuff that actually is new is not sound, is not well argued. One of the painful things that I realized during the reading of this book is that I knew more about certain topics than they did. And when you're reading like an academic book, a nonfiction academic book, and you realize that you know stuff the author doesn't know, and they're supposed to be the expert on the topic, and you like the author, that's painful. That hurts a little bit in your soul. Because I definitely wanted to like this book. The historical anecdotes that they use to support their writing, just the historical anecdotes kind of drag, and they don't really relate to current policy recommendations. Like, there's a whole chapter about the digging of the Panama Canal and what this shows that progress can harm people sometimes. And you just look at that and you're like, okay, fine. But like, you're not the first person to point out that, yeah, bad things happened during the digging of the Panama Canal. And then they kind of try to turn that around and relate it to current policy recommendations. And you're just like, no, current debates about like the healthcare system, you cannot learn anything about what we should be doing with healthcare policy from the Panama Canal. Those two things are not connected. And you just sound kind of crazy when you do try to connect them. And I mean, like, look, technology can be used for good or bad is one of the points of the book. You could argue it's basically the whole thing. And that's a true statement, but it doesn't need a 400-page book. And this is not an original idea. The book kind of feels like it should have been a blog post or an op-ed somewhere. Like a lot of nonfiction academic books, the final chapter of the book is basically a recommendations chapter. We've discussed a lot of theory, we've discussed a lot of ideas. What should we actually do? What are the author's policy recommendations? And those recommendation chapters are always a little bit stapled on. This one is just not good. Again, it vacillates between just bad, like break up the big tech companies. And you know what's funny is I kind of pushed them on this. I interviewed the authors and they were very nice. The interview is better than the book. You should go listen to the interview. Maybe I'm being not humble by saying this, but the interview is much better than the book itself. And I interviewed them and I pushed them on this and they immediately backtracked. You know, Acemoglu, when I asked him, should we really break up the big tech companies? That doesn't seem to follow from the stuff you talk about, your historical examples. He just said, well, I don't know. Maybe it's not the right thing. You know, we want to create a conversation. Well, okay. You know, so some of the policy recommendations are just honestly bad policy. Some of them are fine, but like very vague, like we should have more worker power. Well, okay, but how do we get there? We should invest more in the good technologies that help people. Okay, but how? You know, they want to, one of the other bad ones is they want to repeal Section 230. I don't know, just in the end, a very frustrating book. I think I would sum it up with that idea that, you know, what is original is not good, and what is good is not original. So, unfortunately, can't really recommend Power and Progress by Darren Acemoglu and Simon Johnson. So, now that we're done with that, let's talk about the books that I would recommend. Some of these are going to be strong recommendations, some weaker recommendations, some will be recommendations for a particular kind of person. I'm going to be covering academic, nonfiction, informational stuff. I'm also going to be covering, as I always do, some science fiction and fantasy that I've read during the year. I am a big science fiction and fantasy fan. I read a bunch of it. You know, whether you want to call it sci-fi or speculative fiction, sometimes that's like the hot new term. I don't write science fiction. I write speculative fiction. Okay, well, whatever you want to call it, I enjoy it. So we're going to talk about some of the nonfiction first. Then we're going to take a little interlude for the science fiction. And then at the end of the episode, we will talk about the 4 best books that I've read in 2023 so far, across anything, across any category of book. So I want to start out with 2 books that really logically get grouped together. These are both books that appeared on the podcast as episodes. They are both books about Georgism. So the first book is called Land is a Big Deal by Lars Doucet. Land is a Big Deal is basically a book that is trying to sell you Georgism. And it's very honest about this. It's upfront. The purpose of the book is to describe what Georgism is and why Georgism makes sense and why you should support Georgist ideas like the land value tax primarily. It talks about what the features of a land value tax are, why they work in theory, why they would work in practice, all the benefits that society would get from them. And ultimately, it is trying to sell you. And again, it's open about that. It is a sales pitch of a book. It is a very, very thorough book in terms of addressing almost every conceivable argument for land value taxes. almost every common objection that would come against land value taxes and how the author would respond to those. It's very thorough. It covers many, many different topics all around land value taxes. It's exactly what it says on the label. It is about how land is a big deal and why you should care about the Georgist idea of the land value tax. For me, I would give this a conditional recommendation. If you are somebody who is curious about Georgism and curious about land value taxes, but you don't know a lot about it yet, this book would potentially be a good purchase for you. If you're interested and you want to learn more and you don't know much, this is your one-stop shop kind of to get all the arguments. And yeah, it's not going to be a balanced approach. You're not going to get balance here. You're going to get a sales pitch, but if you go in knowing that, you can kind of adjust your mind to realize you're only getting one side of the argument, potentially. And I think it's a good book for that purpose. Now, if you are already a converted Georgist, you are already fully knowledgeable about why land value taxes are supposed to be good, I'm not sure you need to read this one. It's basically preaching to the unconverted. If you already know the arguments, for large stretches of this book, you're not necessarily going to get a lot out of it because it's making the arguments you've already known. So I think it's a pretty good book for what it's trying to do. I would give this a conditional recommendation for people who are not familiar yet with the arguments. The book is Land is a Big Deal by Lars Doucet. The second book about Georgism that I read this year was called Land and Liberty. It's a book by Christopher England, and the subtitle is Land and Liberty, Henry George and the Crafting of Modern Liberalism. This book is not trying to convert you to be a Georgist. It is not trying to convince you that land value taxes are the best, although I believe the author is certainly very sympathetic to that point of view. This book is a history of how Henry George's movement began and how it developed and how it influenced modern liberalism. And this was something I was not super familiar with, but I'm glad that I read because I do think the book makes a convincing case that Georgism had a pretty significant influence on modern liberalism, especially in America. That Georgism really just changed the direction that liberalism was going in. And, liberals did not become Georgists for the most part. Certainly many of them became Georgists, some of them. But, Georgism is an interesting philosophy in that it was ascendant for a while. It certainly looked like the next big political philosophy at one point in time. And then it just kind of died out. And, it's only having a very small resurgence now, like on the internet. It basically got to a reasonably high peak. It got some, elected officials in major cities and then just kind of vanished. And yet, it had a lasting influence on the way that liberalism developed. Liberals did not become Georgists, but they were certainly influenced by them heavily. So the book tries to make that case, and I think it makes a good case. I think it's an interesting, well-written book. I think that, learning some of the history of this period when Henry George was alive, and then in the aftermath of Henry George and his immediate death, how his acolytes tried to spread the good word of the land value tax, the single tax, as they called it. That was interesting. It was a lot of history that I did not yet know. And ultimately, if you are interested in the history of liberalism, in American history, in Georgism itself, this book is probably going to have a lot of stuff. Even if you are already a dedicated Georgist, this book will have things that you did not know about the history of the movement and how Georgism and liberalism really complement each other in some ways. So in that sense, I would recommend it to anybody interested in those big ideas, liberalism, Georgism, the development of American history and American political thought. If you're interested in those topics, and you probably are because you're listening to this podcast, it's a good book. Land and Liberty, Henry George and the Crafting of Modern Liberalism by Christopher England. The next nonfiction book that I want to talk about is called Lingo. It's by Gaston Dorén. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. My apologies to Gaston if I am pronouncing it incorrectly. But Lingo is a book about European languages. The subtitle of Lingo is Around Europe in 60 Languages, and I believe there is an attempt here to cover every language on the European continent, at least those that are major languages according to some definition of major and originate on the European continent. It starts all the way back, talking about Proto-Indo-European, which is kind of the mother language that led to all European languages and in all kind of even a lot of Indian languages like Sanskrit and Hindi, I believe, and how that developed into the modern European languages. And I do think it basically goes everywhere, not just, German, French, Italian, Russian, but it gets into the Finno-Ugric languages, Romansh, Lithuanian, Ossetian, Galatian, the Channel Island Norman and Yiddish and Icelandic and, Scots and Frisian and Luxembourgish. It really tries to actually get like every European language. And I'm sure you could nitpick and say, there's this one tiny language that they overlooked, but it goes pretty far down. And it's just each language gets a small chapter. Each language gets, somewhere between 5 to 6 pages to explain where did this language come from? What branch of the tree is it? Did it come from the Germanic family, the Romance family, the kind of Cyrillic Russian family, the Finno-Ugric family? Is it one of those weird ones like Basque where we're like, we don't know where the hell Basque came from? It's a mystery. It talks about how it's actually being used today. Is it in wide use? Is it in very minor use? Is it almost dead? It talks about some fun facts about the language. Some languages have like weird grammatical stuff going on. Some languages have 8 different genders. Some languages have 11 different cases. Some languages don't have the word the, like every language has like weird, cool quirks about it that make it an interesting language. I love etymology. I love learning about languages. So for me, this is just kind of like catnip. I think it's always interesting to learn about, are these languages written differently, written in different scripts? Are they spoken differently? Do they have weird verbal tics about them when they are spoken? How are the vocabularies built? Do these languages tie into like modern political battles? Because language in the real world, not just the academic world, in the real world, language can be very political. And so all of this stuff, the politics of these languages, the history of the languages, the technical details of how they are written and spoken and their grammar and their vocabulary, all of that is super interesting. It goes through all of these languages. I really enjoyed it. It's a pretty light read. This is not going to be something that, you have to really like super focus to read it and absorb a bunch of crazy technical argumentation in history and remember a bunch of facts. Like, it's very light. This can be like, just fun reading, even though it is nonfiction. But ultimately, if you enjoy etymology and languages and learning about how the development of this sort of stuff happens, I would recommend this. It's a good book. Lingo, Around Europe in 60 Languages by Gaston Dorén. The next nonfiction book that I want to talk about is a book that I really enjoyed and probably just barely missed out on being in the top 4. But it's something that, it's hard to encapsulate in one of these like 4-minute reviews that I'm doing on a podcast. I'm hoping maybe we can do a podcast on this some point in the future, but it's called Identity by Francis Fukuyama. Now, we've had Fukuyama on the podcast, and that was more to talk about the kind of grand sweep of history ideas that he did in his Political Order and End of History series. But he's also written about identity and how identities develop and how identity politics works today. And if you listen to this podcast, you've probably heard me say many times that one of the theories of this podcast and one of my theories of how politics works is that basically all politics is identity politics. That, yeah, we typically think of that as, you care about Black Lives Matter if you're Black. You care about abortion if you're a woman. That's identity politics. But I think that, being a gun owner is an identity now. Gun policy is not some abstract principle as much as it is an identity. I own guns. I am a gun person. That's my identity. And that this is the case for a lot of issues, maybe even almost all of them. Maybe even for our ideologies. You can think of yourself as, well, I don't operate based on my identity. I operate based on high ideals and values. But our ideals are now identities. People identify as liberals or as socialists or as whatever. So I'm a big fan of this. And I'm, anytime that something intelligent is written about how identity develops in politics, I'm there. That's my topic. I love it. And I think this book is well written and well argued. Part of the book is kind of historical. It talks about how identity developed in politics over time, going back to identity used to not matter that much because we were in a world where there wasn't a lot of interaction. If you were a peasant in France, you lived in a village and everybody in your village was the same religion and the same race. And identity didn't matter that much because you were all just the same people. But as we kind of lost connection with that world and as we entered a more chaotic, interconnected world, identity started to matter. And those chapters are very interesting and I like them a lot. It also talks about more modern politics and how identity politics came to be in the modern age, post World War II. And, Fukuyama is at times critical of identity politics. I think he walks a good line between criticizing some aspects of how identity politics works without criticizing the concrete goals that some groups want to achieve. For instance, he would be supportive of the Me Too movement to end sexual harassment and end the assault of women and things like that. He would be supportive of Black Lives Matter for the idea that, Black people are treated unfairly by the police and we as a society should change this. And yet he would be critical in some ways of the ways that identity politics are used for other purposes. It's hard to sum up a book that is as nuanced as this. You really just have to read it. But I do think that Fukuyama walks the line very well, and his nuanced portrayal of how identity politics works is a good one and a valuable one. So I was a big fan of this book, Identity by Francis Fukuyama. The last nonfiction book that I want to talk about before we go into kind of our science fiction interlude is a book that I really enjoyed that's called Emergent Tokyo. This is a book by Joe McReynolds and Naoki Saito, and the full title is Emergent Tokyo: Designing the Spontaneous City. Now, I am a big, big fan of Tokyo. If you listen to this podcast again, you may have noticed this, you may have heard this before, but obviously I'm a big urbanist. I care a lot about urban issues and housing and transit, and we talk about these things all the time. And I live in New York City, which is the greatest American city. And I love New York, and I'm a proud New Yorker. But it pains me a little bit to say, but even being a New Yorker, Tokyo is my favorite city in the world. Tokyo is just an immaculate, awesome city, just in so many ways. And this book, Emergent Tokyo, basically tries to build a theory of why Tokyo feels so damn cool and so damn awesome all the time. And I think the book makes an interesting case and a convincing case for why Tokyo is so cool. The book's central argument is that Tokyo has a lot of very small, very spontaneously designed spaces. that are not like centrally organized or at best have like a loose central organization, but that are mostly fractured into very small pieces and then left to the creative impulse of the small business owner, of the, small artisan. And that creates a really cool urban landscape that people just enjoy more. You could contrast, say, a giant glass tower, one building with a giant glass tower that kind of creates a lot of dead, empty space. And certainly Tokyo has some of that, but it's not the dominant form of architecture in Tokyo. But you can contrast that kind of empty glass tower with tons of empty space with something like a small market that has a bunch of stalls that are very, very, very small each, but they're all packed so close together, and there's so many of them. It's such a big market that it just feels alive and interesting when you walk through it. And the space is all being utilized. And, it talks about the different features of Tokyo. It talks about the Yokucho alleyways. It talks about kind of these dense 8 to 9 story buildings that have like a different, actual retail use or restaurant on every story. You can walk up 5 stories and there's a yakitori bar or a ramen noodle place on the 5th or 6th story. And just how alive this makes the city feel, that they basically, cut up their urban space into very small plots, very tiny little bars or very tiny little restaurants, and then just let people do whatever they want for the most part. Whereas in other cities, they may try to sell the land or the buildings as like big blocks. You want to buy a big block of a building for commercial use or for residential use or for corporate use or whatever. Whereas Tokyo just splits it up a lot smaller and a lot finer, and that just creates more interesting spaces. I think the book's case is pretty well argued, and having been to Tokyo just a number of times, 7 or 8 times at this point, those are the spaces that I love. I love the Zakyo buildings. I love the, the little alleyways, the yokuchos that comprise all the best bar areas, all the really crowded, cramped restaurants where you're just crammed in with strangers, drinking, eating. It's great. It is what makes Tokyo really cool. And so this book was great for me. It's also just a gorgeous book, by the way. It's mostly about the architecture and how Tokyo is designed. And it gets into the policy and the history of that as well. But it's a gorgeous book in that it includes amazing illustrations, just incredibly detailed, vivid illustrations of exactly what they mean. You're not going to have to sit there and try to wonder, like, okay, well, when they talk about this alleyway, what does it look like? Am I going to have to imagine that in my head? No, they're going to show you in detail with like really cool cross sections of how things are built. And like, it's a gorgeous book. So if you are interested in urbanism or Japanese cities, culture, heavily recommend Emergent Tokyo, Designing the Spontaneous City by Joe McReynolds and Naoki Saito. All right, so with that said, let's move into kind of the science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction interlude. I want to talk about 4 sci-fi and speculative fiction books that I read this year before we get to the top 4 of the episode, which is what we will close with, the top 4 books of any kind that I read this year. The first one that I'll talk about is called The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. The conceit here of the book is that if you watch scary movies, if you watch horror movies, the final girl is the one who's left standing at the end of the movie. In most of these films, most of the characters die. If you're watching a pretty standard horror movie, almost everybody dies, but usually there's one survivor at the end. And usually the trope is that it's a girl. There's one girl who has survived to the end through her determination and her sheer will, and she emerges bloodied but victorious over the killer. And this book is about what happens after that, to some extent. There's a number of these girls in this universe. It's set in like kind of a real world style universe, like our world. But there's different women who have been like the survivors of mass killings and the survivors of like horror movie style scenarios. And they have a literal support group that they go to. Like they all sit around in a circle and talk about their experiences as final girls. And, afterwards, how they're getting on with their lives. Does it still haunt them? Does it not? Blah, blah, blah. Group therapy. That's where we start. And the main character is one of these real life final girls who survived a massacre, many, many years ago, like a decade ago. And it defines her life still. She's still very paranoid. And then some of the final girls that she also knows start to disappear. And they start to be killed. And they start to be missing. And it looks like somebody is trying to hunt down the final girls. And it's kind of like, who will be the final girl of the final girls? This book was pretty good. It's a very light read. Like, it's a popcorn book. It's a popcorn read. And I thought it was decent. I can't give it much more than decent. I feel like by the end of the book, it begins to drag just a little bit. But, I did finish it and I did enjoy it overall. I would give this book kind of a weak recommendation. If you think the concept is interesting, if you like horror movies, maybe give it a chance. It's The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. The next book that I want to talk about is called Pale Lights. This is a web serial from the same author that put out my favorite work of fantasy that I've ever read in any medium, Practical Guide to Evil. If you've listened to the books episodes before, you know how much I love Practical Guide to Evil. Legitimately one of the best things I've ever read in any format. I like to read web serials. It's a format that, has a lot of variation. I've read some really astoundingly good things like Practical Guide to Evil, like Worm, like Unsong. If you read a lot of them, though, there's also some losers in there. Anybody can write a web serial. Some of them are just low quality. They're kind of amateur sometimes, but you can stumble into some gems. And this author of Practical Guide to Evil has finished that work and is now writing a new web serial called Pale Lights. And book 1 is finished. I read it earlier this year, and I think it's promising. Like a lot of web serials, the first book or the first story arc is really just getting its feet underneath the story, so to speak. These are very, very long-running things that usually go for years and years before they wrap up the story. They'll publish once or twice a week, updating the story with a new chapter, and so you'll get new chapters on a steady diet, and it'll take years for the main story to wrap up. And so just finishing the first book, the first story arc, you kind of just looking for something with promise. And I think Pale Lights has promise. The author is still quite good at writing. They're still very evocative, and they're very good at playing around with tropes and with kind of concepts. The concept of Pale Lights is it's a pretty standard fantasy world populated by humans with like a interesting magic system. But the key idea that kind of sets it apart is that each human, or not every human, but many humans can have a contract with a god. And the gods here are not like super powerful gods. They're not like almighty deities. They will be like the god of small tricks, where you get like the ability to influence luck just a little bit, like little small nudges, or the god of accuracy, where, when you throw things, you're more accurate than you should be. It's like gods that give you small abilities, very, very small things. And you kind of have to let them into your soul a little bit. There's like downsides too. But a lot of humans basically make a pact with like a small god, and it gives them abilities to do things. And so we meet some characters, and they're walking through this world, and they have things happening to them. And, I don't want to recap the whole plot, but it's an interesting world. And I obviously love the author. And so I'm looking forward to reading book 2. I enjoyed book 1. And if you like this kind of thing, if you like web serials and this kind of fantasy world, I would recommend it. Pale Lights. The next book that I want to talk about is called Bunny Bunny is kind of a wild, weird book. It's by Mona Awad, and I think this is like it was a very like hot book on the cultural scene for a minute. I think it's something that like a lot of book people were like crazy about. It made waves in the community, I think. The book is about a girl named Samantha who is going to a highly selective Masters of Fine Arts program at some like liberal arts college in New England. And she doesn't feel like she fits in. She's like not from the rich crowd or the privileged crowd that often goes to this school. And she, in her classes, has a clique of really rich, really like preppy girls who all call each other Bunny. It's like 4 or 5 girls, I think. Maybe it's only it's like 3 or 4 girls. And they have this clique, and they're in the MFA program, and all of them call all of the other ones Bunny. Bunny, how are you doing today? You look so great in that dress, Bunny. Oh, Bunny, your hair is amazing. Bunny, I loved your story. No, Bunny, I loved your story. It was so creative. It made me feel so many emotions. Thank you, Bunny. Like just imagine the most obnoxious and unbearable like clique of that nature that you can possibly imagine. And that's what Samantha's dealing with. And Samantha gets an invite to join the bunnies, to join the bunny clique, and then things just, they devolve from there. This is a very odd book. It takes like crazy left turns. Like you think you're reading one thing, and then it takes a left turn and you're reading a whole different kind of book. I won't spoil too much, but it's kind of like the movie Heathers, and it's kind of like The Craft, and it's kind of like all of like Heathers meets The Craft in a weird liberal arts, fine arts program. And like, if you know anything about Heathers and The Craft, it means that things are going to get weird and bloody at some point. There's going to be like some witchcraft and some weird spooky shit going on. But I enjoyed it. Like I said, if you enjoy books that are a little bit creepy, and if you enjoy books that are like cultural commentary, like biting commentary on the social scene, and if you enjoy books that take like a sharp left turn and like all of a sudden you're doing something different in the book, then you'll enjoy Bunny. That's the kind of book it is. So I can't say too much more without like ruining all the twists, but Bunny by Mona Awad. Recommend if you like a book that keeps you on your toes. The final book that I'll include here in this sci-fi and fantasy interlude, before we get to the final 4, the best 4 books I've read this year, which, that one will have 1 or 2 sci-fi books as well, but I'll consider them separate. But before we get to those, the final book in this interlude is called Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Piranesi is another book that has won many awards. It's nominated for something like maybe the Hugo or the Nebula or something like that. It's been like making the circles of like, ooh, this is a good one. Everybody should pay attention to this one. And it's interesting. If Bunny was like a very sharp, cutting kind of book, this book, Piranesi, almost has a more dreamlike quality to it. It's very ethereal in a sense. And I know this is an odd way to describe a book, but the book is mainly about one character. The character's name is Piranesi, and Piranesi lives in this house that is not an ordinary house. It is not an ordinary building. It is an infinite building, essentially. The building just goes forever. You can almost, it almost seems like a museum. Like Piranesi lives in this museum that just goes on forever. And it seems to be the only world that Piranesi has ever known. Piranesi is just a character who lives in this museum that goes on forever. North and south and west and east. Piranesi navigates by saying, oh, well, that's the eastern halls that go 233, things that way. And further than that, I haven't explored. The western halls, I've explored 180 rooms. And like Piranesi explores, but he just kind of lives in this weird infinite house with a lot of statues and all these rooms that are different from each other. And you kind of just explore this world with Piranesi and things start to happen, things start to change. All of a sudden, there are new people who are coming into the house that Piranesi has never seen before. There's not a society inside the house. It's just him and maybe like one other person. But then things start to change and one or two new people show up and Piranesi starts to question, is the house really all that there is? It's a very like dreamlike book that is like filled with more like wonder at the world. And, you know, you kind of float through it to some extent. I'm kind of using these vague metaphors because, again, I don't want to spoil what happens, but it's very kind of metaphorical and conceptual, whereas Bunny was very like sharp and cutting and like hits you in the face a lot. Piranesi more caresses you more than it hits you in the face. I really enjoyed it. If you enjoy this kind of more like high concept journey through like one character's slow realization of certain things, I would recommend it. It's definitely, the prose is very beautiful. It's won awards. It's been nominated for awards. It's a good book. So if you like this kind of like dreamlike fantasy world, check out Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. And now we get to the 4 best books, the top 4 that I've read so far in 2023. This is going to include 2 works of fiction and 2 works of nonfiction. The first book, number 4 on the list, is Several People Are Typing. This book is by Calvin Kasulke. It is a bizarre book that I loved. It is basically a work-from-home comedy. It's a very, very funny book. The whole book is basically comedic. It's a very deeply funny book. The point of the book is to be funny, and it succeeds wildly. The whole thing is told through Slack messages. The entire book is through the channel of Slack. It's written in the form of a Slack channel. And it is just an incredibly funny kind of dissection and satire of like virtual work and how we live our lives contemporarily through virtual channels. That's where the name of the book, Several People Are Typing. If you've ever used Slack, you've probably seen that at some point. And I'll reveal just one thing because it's kind of the main thing that happens, and I won't get into how it gets resolved. But all these people are working from home and they're all coordinating over Slack, and the book is just very, very funny. And one of the characters, Gerald, announces that like, I'm stuck in Slack. And everybody is like, yeah, haha, know how you feel. Me too. And Gerald says, no, like, I'm stuck inside Slack. And they're like, yeah, I feel chained to it as well. Got to take some time off. Got to recharge. And Gerald says, you are not understanding me. I am literally trapped in here. I have become a disembodied something, bit of code or voice or text. I am inside Slack. Please help. And of course, their response is, haha, you're such a kidder. And there's... Gerald continues to insist, and they continue to not believe him. Eventually, the story progresses. Somebody does believe him. Blah blah blah. We won't get into how the whole thing progresses. We won't spoil the book, but I will just say the book is incredibly funny. The characters are entirely believable. If you work in a corporate setting or an office setting, you will instantly recognize some of these characters. You will cringe at some of the ways that these things happen. It will be relatable in a hilarious and painful way. I can't say enough good things about it. It's a creative book. It's different than anything. It's not like anything I've read, but heavily recommend if you enjoy books that are very funny and a little bit bizarre and are kind of satirical about modern office culture. This one's for you. The number 4 book this year, Several People Are Typing by Calvin Kasulke. The number 3 book this year is Paved Paradise by Henry Grabar. This is a book we actually covered on the podcast very recently, and I really enjoyed it. This book is about parking. The subtitle is How Parking Explains the World. It's an ambitious subtitle. How could something as mundane and basic and uninteresting as parking spaces explain the world? But the book makes a very strong case that parking does, in fact, explain a lot about how we structure our cities, how we live our lives, where we live, how we build our dwellings, where we work, how we travel. Like, a lot of how we've actually built society is built around the car, and specifically how we store our cars. Because even the most used cars will still be, not used, sitting, off, dormant, in a parking space or a garage of some kind for the majority of their lives. Even if this is the most heavily used car, it's still just going to be parked most of the time. And, the book makes a really good case. It's a very readable book. You can read it in a day or two. It is not a difficult read. You're not going to have to struggle through it. And I just think it's a great policy book. One of my favorite kinds of these policy books is the kind that shows you something new. Because look, I read a lot of nonfiction policy books. Here's a book about housing policy. Here's a book about immigration policy. Here's a book about minimum wage policy. Here's a book about this and this and that and that and that. And at some point, I appreciate a lot of these books, but I am always hesitant to read a book about certain topics because at some point you just know what you know. I don't really need to read another book about the housing crisis because I've already read like 10 of them. There's not that much that's new for me to discover about the housing crisis. We need to build more houses. That's about it. Sometimes I feel the same way about immigration. I've read a lot of books and a lot of papers about immigration, and it's kind of hard to hit me with something new. You really have to actually get something new to interest me. And so I love when I can read a policy book that is about some aspect of politics or public policy that is actually new and refreshing. And for me, at least, this book is that. It talks about the history of parking in a way that I've not seen before. It talks about the economics of parking. And, I knew a lot of the general outlines of the arguments that were made here. I know that, it's bad to have free street parking in our densest cities, but I didn't know the details, and I didn't know what people are trying to do about it and how it got to be that way. There was a lot of information in here that I did not yet know, and so this book definitely scratched an itch. If you are an urbanist, if you care about housing policy, if you care about land use, if you care about transit, you should read this book. This is a strong recommendation. You should read Paved Paradise by Henry Grabar. All right, so we have 2 books to go. The penultimate book, the number 2 second best book that I read all year this year, was So You've Been Publicly Shamed. This is a book by Jon Ronson, and it is about the phenomenon of online cancellation of public shaming. At the time that Ronson wrote this book, I don't think cancel culture was really a phrase back then, but it's very much in the line of cancel culture. He calls it public shaming, tomato to some extent. I wrote a blog post on this over on Infinite Scroll, reviewing this book, and I really, really enjoyed the book. As I said, I'm fascinated by our social systems on the internet, how we relate to each other online, how there's these new and interesting ways that humanity is behaving, and that social media and the internet is driving these things forward. All of that fascinates me. And this book is a really in-depth, really interesting look at one of those new phenomenon, the online shaming, the public shaming, the cancellation. The book begins with a small-scale instance of online shaming from Ronson's own life. There were a few people who created a fake Jon Ronson Twitter account, and they annoyed him for a little while. And then he got fed up and he posted about it, and they were forced to apologize and take it down after they got like this small wave of criticism. They did not get majorly canceled, but they did have people harassing them a little bit for doing this. And Ronson kind of looked at that and said, that's weird. Like, I asked them politely to take it down and they didn't. But then like a mob of people went after them and they did. And in this case, again, this was pretty small scale. But I think it's what motivated Jon Ronson's interest in the subject. The book focuses on a number of instances of public shaming, and it includes like stories about powerful and well-known subjects of public shaming, as well as non-public figures who are suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Some of these subjects include Justine Sacco, who was the AIDS tweet lady, who tweeted about some slightly off-color joke about AIDS and got canceled while she was on a flight and came back and was fired when the plane landed. It talks about Jonah Lehrer, who's exposed for plagiarism. It talks about Max Mosley, who had his sexual kinks published all over the tabloid newspapers. It talks about Donglegate, where a developer at a conference made a joke about a dongle and was fired from his job. It talks about Mike Daisey, who fabricated stories about being in China. It talks about Lindsay Stone, who posed for a crude picture in front of a military cemetery and was, subjected to a wave of online hate. It's just a good book in terms of, it catalogs the internet's tendency to engage in this kind of mass scale shaming and to analyze the profound impact that has on individuals and on society. I think it's an important book solely for that reason, in that, as far as I know, nobody else has written a book that actually examines the impact on these people's lives. You took one picture that was disrespectful, and now hundreds of thousands of people hate you. Millions of people know your name. You're getting death threats. You're getting rape threats. People dox your address. You're fired from your job. This is all stuff that happens because you made one ill-timed joke. And you aren't even a famous person. You're just a nobody who the Twitter mob or whoever decided to cancel today. The book kind of tries to break all this down, and Ronson approaches it like a reporter. The typical subject, he just tries for all these people, what's the background? What's the context? I'll do an interview with them. What was this person like before the shaming started? What in their background could have led to this? Why were they shamed, and who did the shaming? And how did the people doing the shaming interpret the episode? Did they feel regret at what happened? I think the writer, Ronson, is like very genuinely empathetic towards these people, and he really wants to understand them and understand the phenomenon involved here. And he really hammers home the devastating impact that this kind of shaming can have. What it is like to become a pariah and have waves of people just despise you. If there's any flaw in the book, it's that it kind of lacks a grand theory. It's much more of a descriptive book than it is a theoretical book. He never really builds a grand theory of why people are shamed or how you should respond to shaming. But ultimately, even with that shortcoming, this is just a very well-written book. And if you want to understand the internet, I think you need to understand this book. I think you need to read this book. I would recommend it to anybody who engages in online culture. The book is So You've Been Publicly Shamed by Jon Ronson. And finally, the best book that I've read so far in 2023, No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. Boy, where do I even start with this book? I would describe this book as the most online book I've ever read. I've just talked to you about a lot of different internet books. We read a book about fangirls that I did not enjoy and how they influence internet culture. We read a book about public shaming, which is an online phenomenon. We read Several People Are Typing, which, is about a guy who literally gets trapped inside Slack. Weirdly, like by a demon or whatever, I don't know. And yet this book, No One Is Talking About This, is the most online book I've ever read. It is the most authentic capture of the voice of what it is like to be terminally online that I've ever seen. I've never seen another book so authentically capture, the very online persona. No other book manages to get it right, and this book just nails it. Just fucking perfectly, man. I really enjoyed it. Now, I will say, if you are not incredibly online, this book may be like unintelligible to you at parts. If you are very online, you should read this book. It is about a woman who, has become famous on social media. She calls it the portal. The book, for whatever reason, just calls it the portal because maybe that's cooler than calling it the internet. But this woman has recently had like a bunch of posts go viral. You could almost think of her as like drill in a sense. I think the post that makes her go viral, the first one anyway, they get to a bunch of her posts, but she just tweeted out, "Can a dog be twins?" And somehow that got like 500,000 likes and retweets. And like people are putting it on shirts now. Can a dog be twins? It reminds me of like the shrimps is bugs thing. If you ever saw that. If you're not online, don't worry about what I'm talking about. But, this woman becomes very, very famous online, and she begins to really think about what it means to be online, and she posts all the time. And it talks about like what it's like to be a poster, how these online communities work. It is just such a good representation of how extremely onlineism works. And then, it's for that reason alone, I would love it. Are we in hell? The people of the portal ask themselves. Are we going to keep doing this until we all die? It's just very funny. It's a deeply funny book, as well as being very authentic about what it's like to be online and the voice of the people who are online. And then about 2/3 of the way through the book, maybe halfway through, maybe 2/3 of the way through, the main character gets a text from her mother. Something has gone wrong. How fast can you get here? And the book just turns like that. And it becomes very, very, very different. And it's almost like two different books. And I'm not going to tell you what happens in the second half of the book. The first half of the book is incredibly funny and enjoyable. And if you're part of the super online, I need to touch grass kind of tribe, you will enjoy that. And then the second half of the book is just totally different. But I think it puts a lot of the first half into perspective. Because, it's, again, I don't want to spoil too much, but two of the scariest texts you could get in sequence are, "Something has gone wrong. How soon can you get here?" So I'll leave it at that. Highly recommend this book if you are one of my internet people. The book is No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. So that's the episode. Those are the 15 books that I have read thus far in 2023. We got to talk about a lot of different stuff. We got to talk about land use and languages and urbanism and internet culture and science fiction and parking and just all sorts of stuff. History, technology. We really covered it all here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. We will, of course, have the second part of this episode, the best books of 2023, part 2, at the end of the year in December. And until then, thank you for listening, and we'll see you at the next one.